Three teenagers were hanging out by a pond when a dark shape suddenly floated up from the bottom of the water. They took a closer look and realized it was a scuba diver. He was floating face down in the water, completely motionless, with no air bubbles rising around him. The three of them knew something was seriously wrong, so they jumped into the water to check on him. That's when they discovered the diver was no longer breathing. So, who was this diver, and what happened to him? On the morning of the 22nd of June 2022, 52-year-old Todd and 63-year-old Stephen drove out to Buford Spring. Both men were recreational divers, but neither of them held a full cave diving certification. When they arrived at Buford Spring, they noticed three teenagers swimming inside. The two men chatted with the teens while gearing up. About 10 minutes later, the three teenagers got out of the water to take a break, and Todd and Stephen jumped in. Each of them carried only a single tank filled with regular compressed air. Once they were all set, the two entered the cave's main chamber through an opening at the bottom of the pond. They were immediately captivated by the stunning scenery. Sunlight streamed through the entrance all the way down to the cave floor, casting shimmering ripples of light across the rocks. It was absolutely beautiful. After about half an hour, the two returned to the surface. The three teenagers were still resting on the shore. Todd and Stephen weren't ready to call it a day, so they stayed in the water. The first dive had gone smoothly and hadn't been particularly challenging, which made them want to push deeper and explore more of the cave. During this time, Todd mentioned that his tank seemed to have a slight leak, but after a short while, the two decided to go back down for another dive anyway. About 20 minutes later, the teenagers on shore noticed a dark shape slowly floating up from below the surface. It looked like one of the divers who had gone down earlier. The person was floating face down in the water. The teens figured he was just looking down at his dive buddy below, so they didn't think much of it. But 2 minutes passed, and the person still hadn't moved at all. There were no air bubbles coming up around him either. The three teenagers sensed that something was off, so they jumped into the water to check. They found that it was Todd, and he appeared to have stopped breathing. They tried to drag him to shore, but Todd was far too heavy with all his gear on, and they couldn't manage it. With no other option, they called 911. Around 12:20, police and emergency responders arrived on the scene. They first pulled Todd out of the water and onto the bank, but it was clear he had been dead for some time. Two rescue divers then entered the water to search for Stephen. After about 15 minutes, they found him on a gradual slope at a depth of 42 meters underwater. Stephen had also drowned. His body was subsequently recovered from the water. After a preliminary examination, police determined that both men's tanks were completely empty. A medical examiner later performed autopsies on both divers and ruled out any pre-existing medical conditions or other injuries as contributing factors. The conclusion was fairly straightforward. Both men had run out of air and drowned. Experts were able to piece together a rough timeline of what happened by analyzing the data from the two men's dive computers. After their first dive, Todd and Stephen misread their tank pressure gauges. They mistook the pressure reading for the remaining volume of air and believed they had more than enough gas for another dive. If they had simply stayed in the main chamber, that probably would have been true. But instead, once they descended, they swam straight into the deeper sections of the cave. Within a few minutes, all natural light from the entrance had completely disappeared. The sediment on the cave floor also became much thicker. Still, they kept pushing forward. As their fins kicked up more and more silt, visibility in the water began to drop rapidly. That was when fear started to set in. Their breathing quickened, and their air consumption spiked. They decided to turn around and head back. But when they reached a depth of 42 meters on their return, Stephen's regulator appeared to malfunction. He couldn't draw any air from it at all. His tank pressure had dropped so low that the regulator had automatically shut off the gas supply. It wasn't long before Stephen lost consciousness and stopped struggling. Todd, however, did not share his own air with Stephen, because Todd's tank was nearly empty as well. He had no choice but to leave his partner behind. In his final desperate moments, Todd held his breath while inflating his buoyancy vest, ascending rapidly toward the surface. Clinging to his last shred of consciousness, he struggled to pull himself out through the cave entrance. But tragically, he was just seconds too late. Todd began drowning before he could reach the surface. Eventually, the buoyancy of his inflated vest carried his body up to the surface, but by that point, he had already drowned. That is the full account of this incident. The truth is, accidents like this are entirely preventable. We only get one life, and we cannot afford to gamble with it. Cave diving is not the same as regular recreational diving. Proper certification, the right equipment, and careful gas planning are all absolutely essential. Respect the cave. Coming back alive is the only thing that truly matters.